Good evening, everybody. I'll be very short because I want to make sure we have enough time for the event. We have an amazing panel for you, and we have a simple process. But first, I would like to really recognize the champions of this. Venk already identified them and mentioned them. The chair for the event, Abhi Gholap, and our committee members, co-chairs, have spent several weeks putting this together for you, and they deserve special recognition. So they will actually get involved with you guys later on. Please swap cards with them and engage with them further if you need to get involved with TIE. I'd also like to especially recognize one person who's been very instrumental in an amazing energy behind this SIG and every event that we do here. I'm the board member for TIE program, so I have oversight over all the programs we have here. So I have to especially mention our program manager, Dipti Desai, who amazing energy and continued strength. So she will really be the point of contact for all of you, and I think you've received an email from her, so you can reply back if you need any questions. So without much ado, let me go right ahead and then bring Abhi onto the stage, and he'll take it over from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ram. So first of all, thank you so much for all of you to gather here in a big number. This is our first SIG event for this year on digital health. And we were brainstorming among our team, what could be the right topic. But now looking at the number of registrations and number of people that we had to decline saying that, hey, we have limited space, I think this topic and this panel, I'm sure that you would love this evening. Before I start, I really would like to thank Venk and Ram to give me this opportunity to put together, and most importantly, Mahen and Sanjay and Sanjeev and Mohan, Pradeep, to help us out in organizing this event. Just to give a little bit of background about what are we going to do this evening, we are going to have a panel discussion related to the different investment opportunities when it comes to digital health. And then thereafter, we are going to have a talk by Wen McDonnell from PwC. But most importantly, before we start, I am going to invite Mohan Uttarwar to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Peter Fitzgerald, who will be starting this session today. Digital health, can be always interpreted from the different perspectives. People are always relating digital health as a word to the healthcare aspects. But we would like to also consider the life science dimension of digital health while we will be discussing about digital health here tonight, as well as another event that we are planning towards end of January, as well as the TIE conference where we will be having a half-day track on digital health. So as a digital health, we are interested to discuss about medical devices, which also will include the therapeutic as well as the diagnostic aspects. But most importantly, the wearable also becomes a part of the medical devices. The second dimension of digital health would be mainly focused on precision medicine, where we will be talking about the life science informatics, genomics aspect of it, toxicology, pharmacovigilance, drug safety. And then the third dimension of digital health will be connected health, where we'll be talking about the EMRs and patient outcomes and payers and the insurance aspects. So we would like to be considering the discovery, development, toxicology, testing, preclinical, clinical, and diagnostic as a complete spectrum of digital health here. And whole of this evening would be discussing around that. So there will be also a question and answer session for you to interact with the speakers. And as we go along, we'll keep on introducing to you how we are going to go about it. So first of all, I would request Mohan to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thanks, Abhi. Thanks, Ty. And it's a good evening, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. It's my distinct privilege and pleasure to introduce our keynote today, a dear friend who's so accomplished that if I tell you all his accomplishment, I would probably take the most of the evening. But somebody with a passion to apply the innovation in technology to transform healthcare couldn't have been a better keynote speaker than Peter, who by education, he did his PhD in engineering, did his innovation when he was a student, and exited that by creating a new technology that will do the alcohol testing, and he paid for his medical school. So, he's both a director in the technology space at Stanford as well as in the core lab. So he multiple hats he wears. I don't know how he keeps up juggles multiple ball. The energy is unbelievable. The amount of things he's done, I think, is really puts me certainly to this thing. And as a professor, his outstanding track record, 17 postdocs. Over a decade, he's probably trained over 150, 175 clinical studies, over 550 different publications, papers in absolute outstanding journals, and over and above, that's not enough. He's actually heading the Stanford Asia MedTech Innovation Program. As an entrepreneur, he started over 21 different companies here in Bay Area. 14 of them saw very successful exits. And he's on a number of boards, advisory boards. Needless to say, he doesn't sleep much. But outstanding track record, both as an entrepreneur and a very successful advisor. And then that's not enough. He went on to become a VC. In 2001, he started Lateral, a very healthcare medtech focus, who has got more than $500 million in management. He was the co-founder of it. And then, that's not global enough. So he starts in 2009, TriVenture, which does a lot of healthcare deals, both here as well as in Israel. And India is near and dear to him. He's got tremendous number of contacts, connections, and all of that stuff. And lastly, I want to personally thank you for squeezing the time. He's doing a grand rounds at Harvard tomorrow morning and taking a red eye. And Kathy, his wife who is here, I have yet to figure out from Peter, what's the trick that you use to get Kathy to drop you to the airport? Because I have never figured that out myself. But, a little, secret about him, that, if left to do nothing, he will probably be fishing. Now, the fishing he does in his day job is different. He's always looking for opportunities where he can invest. And so, Peter, with that, thank you for coming.
Sure.
Here, Dr. Peter Fitzgerald.
Great. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Mohan. So you can translate all those accolades to the fact that I'm just old. Okay, and that's pretty accurate. So I'd like to just, in the next few minutes, go through what at least I've been part of. And when I say part of, it's really the people around you. Most people should use the word we and not I, because for me, that's certainly the case. But I've been able to, with a number of really smart people, experience some of this digital health. And certainly, we all know this, but sometimes my brethren, I have to teach the fact that this isn't just, it just isn't called Silicon Valley, and I can't get this thing to move here. There it is. It has really been renamed, and you folks know all this, but a lot of my folks don't. I know, you folks are the folks that have brought this to fruition. When my dad started a number of companies here, it was all silicon-based, but it's really changed, and the world doesn't know yet that it's really all about software, and we're going to integrate that piece into a discussion today. By virtue of the fact that I'm a physician, you have to do disclosures. We have conflict of interest. We have Sunshine Act, brought to you by our Republicans in power, to sort of tell you that I do work with a lot of industry that helps me get smarter, helps me understand how to integrate some of these technologies into healthcare. And again, we all work towards bringing concepts into the clinic. We live in a weird valley. I think everybody knows this. Probably people don't know that in 2005, 82% of all the medical devices that were approved came within an 18-mile radius of Hoover Tower. But we collide with people that read their iPhone in the bathtub. And we try to bring technologies into the hospitals. And that collision is actually presenting itself a very unique opportunity here in the Valley. You begin to see it in other places. I see it in Tel Aviv. I see it a little bit in Boston, Minneapolis. But here is really the nucleus of this. And part of it is because we have bubbles that now are reasonably sustainable. Facebook, 10 years old, has a market cap that's $4 billion higher than Johnson & Johnson, that's 120 years old. And we have things like Spotify, Snapchat, Uber, I skipped Theranos on purpose, that have very high evaluations, but they have and are oriented towards revenues. So we're famous for bubbles, but at least we have some sustainability. I'm going to predict, though, that a lot of those Snapchat technologies can be repurposed for streaming to bring doctors closer to patients, and leveraging Lego innovation, we call it, leveraging what's out there for the consumer can come into healthcare, because we're always 5 to 7 years behind you folks for lots of different reasons, but we're always having to adopt this sort of issue. We've got a big hurt in this United States. We spend $3 trillion, and we're 43rd on the life expectancy, just slightly below Albania. And that's not necessarily an efficient way of healthcare. We have patients, 26% of Medicare patients are readmitted after they're discharged within 30 days. Gosh, we gotta do better than that. So a lot of these issues are brought to you by a good friend, Mark McClellan, who used to run the FDA, used to run CMS, those are the people that pay for all our medical device. He says 1 trillion of that 3 trillion is due to the variation. And what I'd like to do is keep that theme going, and how we can decrease that variation of how I practice, how other doctors practice, and how the healthcare system from an inventory and supply chain can potentially be decreased and bite into that 1 trillion. We talk about innovation at Stanford. There's disruptive innovation. There's facilitated innovation. Those are the small things that kind of surround disruptive. We talk about Lego innovation, which is just what we were mentioning. That's the repurposing of technologies into healthcare. And reverse innovation, you probably have all read the book. It's terrific, and that's going to be a major part of innovation as well. So what is disruptive innovation? Disruptive innovation is new things like stents. I'm basically a plumber. But today we put drugs on those stents that go in and not only mechanically open the blood vessels around your heart, but deliver a drug to keep the reaction at bay. Today we're delivering heart valves through your groin, not cutting open your chest. And one of the biggest disruptive issues, which you folks know, that my folks don't necessarily know, is data, data, data. So let's look at the one before. This is a case I did 2 years ago to an 82-year-old woman that couldn't walk because she had such a tight narrowing coming out her heart in her aortic valve. 32 minutes later, with a little hole in her groin, she's got a new valve, and she's chasing her grandkids within 2 days. When I trained in medical school, this was a full-bore operation, and you didn't get home for 10 days, and you had lots of complications for 3 to 4 months. This is disruptive, okay? But what about the data that's disruptive? We've seen a lot of things now begin to combine with things like pacemakers. Today, it's the size of a vitamin pill. I can put this in and have put this in 11 minutes. And we put, just like you dock something on Mars, you dock a small little pacemaker, size of a vitamin pill. It lasts for 10 years, and guess what? It beams out things we've never been able to measure inside the heart. The intramyocardial EKG, the pressure from inside the heart, and it goes to your phone. That combination now of MT and IT is beginning to be reality. And I think that's important because folks in this room are beginning to work with healthcare folks, and that's important. And what we're seeing is coming out of the silos, the omics, the proteomics, the genomics, the metabolomics, information technology and MT beginning to collide. Why? Because omics is basically an IT problem. There is so much information in those omics that we have to use IT to sort through it. The impact that this is going to have is going to be tremendous with respect to hospitals and payers. So I have to explain to my doctors what big data is. So 2 zettabytes per year is produced every year by us, and I know you folks know this, but I have to tell my doctors that that's 1 billion terabytes, okay? 2 billion pictures per week the CIO of Facebook sees. And remember, if he sees you use Facebook 5.2 times, he knows your IQ plus or minus 10%. There's 3 billion base pairs that we do with sequencing the genome today, and there's 100 trillion microbials. And if you don't know what a microbial is, those are the bacteria on your skin, on your gut, and everyone in this room has 4 pounds on average of it, okay? And there's 100 trillion microbials. This is big data, and we have codes at the FDA and CMS that started in the 1800s and are still diagnosing cancer in the same way, and yet we have an exponential way of being able to bring those forth. So we're going to see a big gap between what we're going to be able to regulate and the data that we're going to have at our fingertips. And some of our kids are going to skip over some of those regulatory processes, just like they do for vulnerability on Facebook, to be efficient with respect to information. So a big change is coming, not only in the infrastructure, but in the policy with respect to these things. So it's April, right? It's the bottom of the 9th inning. This guy makes an amazing catch to win the game, right? What does he do? He thanks himself, thanks his mother, thanks the Lord. But that's not what really happens. What really happens is this. Every single player, every single inning, every single game, all the metrics through what? Amazon Web Service are absolutely calculated. So when they trade your favorite 49er player, it's because they see the numbers going down and they're not going to give him a 3-year contract. I like Crabtree. Okay? So this is what goes on for every sport all the time. And you know the customers? You know how we do FanDuel today? We have fantasy football to make money now? That's what populates it, and that's why you'll never win. It's just like going to Vegas. And Amazon sells this to Vegas. And you saw the numbers for Amazon last week, as well as Microsoft. It's because of the web service and the cloud. Now imagine putting this into medicine. Forget the ballpark. This is the ballpark that we live in. This is inside the abdomen, brought to you by the lights, just like you do in a baseball field. And you can now calculate everything a surgeon does. All the 123 surgeons at Kaiser can all of a sudden be mapped, just like that baseball player. You begin to standardize the analysis and begin to standardize how people treat patients to make it more efficient and to cut out some of that variation that we talked about a minute ago. So DNA to data, it's not Arab Spring, it's healthcare spring. We're going to see transforming healthcare to health cure. That's actually a quote from the CEO of Samsung. I work with Samsung. That's an interesting one that somebody at that level talks about. Cure, not care. We know this curve. You can sequence now genes, everybody in this room's genes, under about an hour and a half, and you can do it for about $1,000. It's personalized. It's phenomenal for epidemiology. We saw the front page of The Economist the other day, and we're going to be able to see these kids and be able to re-edit their genome so they don't have ADHD, so that they are water polo players. Now that we're never going to see in anybody's life unless there's an 18-year-old sitting in there somewhere. I think I see one. That you will see, but it's going to take 15 years. What's happening today is it'll be free. Beijing Genomics Incorporated, the largest sequencing operation in Guangzhou today, does make it free. Why? Because the data are far more important than charging somebody a razor blade model. Illumina just hasn't figured this out yet, but I guarantee you they will. The data is far more important. So this kid in the White House goes to our president, who is very silver-tongued, and says, hey, my dad says you read all our emails and all that information stuff. And our silver-tongued leader says, sorry, kid, he's not your father. So this information is ubiquitous, and it's going to be very helpful for how we treat patients upstream, how we treat them in the middle, and how we control our inventory and supply chain. So this is the guy that started, Zhan Wang, BGI 16 years ago, BGI, the Beijing Genomics Center. He's a great guy, and he's a good friend of mine, and he says I can share his sequencing in public. So he's got a high probability of uric acid. Now, uric acid creates these stones in your kidney. Once you get those, you get hospitalized for all sorts of issues. Kidney failure, pyelonephritis. But the issue, what he's doing today, before he has the stones, he's changing his diet, his hydration, and his medication. So let me go back and say, sequencing will be free. I bet you they're going to pay you to sequence. Just like some of the issues we saw in Switzerland recently with respect to the taxation. Why? Because the insurance companies are going to pay you to be proactive on some of the issues that they find. Now, he's also got a PBC risk. What is that? Primary biliary cirrhosis. You don't want to have that disease. But guess what? 50% of all Chinese people are positive for that mutation. So he doesn't even pay attention to it, as he shouldn't. Because you always have to have parity checks. You always have to have cultural integration to all these times you do sequencing. So I told my wife I'm going to be in Guangzhou next couple of weeks. I'm going to get my thing sequenced. I'm just not going to show her. And she said, I can do it if I raise my life insurance. So, I did that, and we'll see my sequencing lately. So the changing landscape, and I'm just going to spend a few more minutes on talking about this. I just talk about those are our kids right there. So just, I know Kathy appreciates that slide. Talk about drug discovery, because we are going to discover drugs very differently with data. Software as a service, I have to spell that out for my medical people. I can't just say SaaS. And it's going to be very important, because having capital equipment is not going to be the mainstay as we go forward in medicine. It's going to be SaaS-based. Haptology, the kids can do things today with their fingertips far better than a surgeon can do things directly with their fingertips. And we have to embrace that. And wearables, we all have our wearables, some for style, some for lifestyle, and some for all sorts of weird things, but we'll talk about that in just a second. Those are my heart cells. How did they get their heart cells? They took my skin, did pluripotential deceleration of the heritage. This was a Nobel Prize by Tanaka. It's called IPS. And then grew them up as heart cells. And my daughter, my 14-year-old, thinks this is really cute. Dad's got his cells beating in a dish. But why is that important? I can test all the drugs that are available for heart disease or heart failure, which I don't have yet, or the ones that are coming, to see whether the proteins are up or down regulated on a human cell and observe whether there's toxicity or not. Think about that in the drug discovery process. Remember, in the drug discovery process, we use mice and their embryonic development. And then we go to primates. And then we find out 5 to 6 years later, we've got a Vioxx problem. This is a way to look at it much earlier. So drug discovery, by using human cells rather than animal molecules, is going to shorten the drug discovery by 2 to 3 years. So that's important. Here's another one that I think is going to be very important. There's a half a dozen companies as you drive down 101 and as you're on the 495 in Boston. We focus, when we do drug development, on specialty pharma. You've heard that from our Hillary representative. Talk about expensive drugs. When you get Sovaldi for $1,000 a pill, that's what she's talking about, okay? But pharma companies want to go there because of the length that they have to do in this discovery program. Or they'll go to oncology. It's a low bar. Nobody's creating new drugs for psoriasis, for arthritis, because it's too risky to do. But what's happening is people are searching through the data. The data's been available for 50 years in the government, in the research papers, and look for drugs that have either failed or you can use them for another purpose. Examples are imipramine. Imipramine is a drug that treats 17-year-olds when they have bipolar disease. But guess what? In all the data, they found out that it shrinked small cell. But imipramine was taken off the market because it made these 17-year-olds itch and have arrhythmias. Listen, if I have small cell and I'm going to be dead in 6 months, I'll itch. Same thing with ketamine, which was just sold to Allergan for $1 billion, 3 years in drug discovery. Because of the data-rich environment we live in and doing the discovery through that. So it was just mentioned a minute ago that it's not just going to affect lifestyles, it's going to affect drug discovery by having this sort of data available. And some of the companies, Numity, all the way to a company I'm going to be with tomorrow called Data 2 Discovery in Boston. So these are, again, taking advantage of the data that's available, using all the AI tools and the deep learning that we have to find candidates to repurpose. So we all know this. I just about hit one today. There's been 8 accidents with the Google car, right? The last one was Tesla, which is really great because that must have really pissed Elon off. But think about all the AI, deep learning that's going on to make those cars work. It's phenomenal. Yes, they have a passenger now, but it's like a 17-year-old. It's like my son. You know, he's probably texting while he's going around because these things just don't crash. So, but the machine learning that's happening is amazing. Vinod Khosla, who I know some of you know, he's a good friend, he says in 3 years, we're going to be going to the airport with nobody in the car that's driving us. It'll be Nuber, not Uber, but it will scale very fast if you don't have FTEs. But the problem are the people. This Google car goes up to a 3-way stop sign and it waits for the other people to stop. Guess what? They don't stop. It goes 55 on 280. Oh my God. And the delta between the fastest car and the slowest car is actually a risk factor for accidents. So we have some things to work out with respect to the humans that this automation is working with. But that aside, think about now taking that technology and working it at the fingertips. This is actually an FDA-approved device to actually move the catheters in to replace your heart valve. And they do it with their haptic knowledge. This isn't a guy my age, but this is a 30-year-old. And they can do this robotically, much more accurately than taking 123 of those people that all have their different ways of doing things at Kaiser. Again, this standardizes the process, decreases that variation, and that's an important thing for patients as well as healthcare. So you see this move from Cisco, Google, Apple, Samsung, some of you folks in this room, they're actually moving into healthcare a little bit quicker than the healthcare guys are because they're going, oh my God, the FDA. Oh my God, HIPAA, Privacy Acts. But these folks are moving in very quickly. And they're migrating not just in lifestyle, but lifestyle to chronic disease management. And this is going to be the new with respect to healthcare. You see Google and J&J getting together $100 million white sheet of paper for robotics. You see Google and AbbVie using some of the folks from Genentech to do Calico, which is chronic brain disorders. Qualcomm and Novartis that are working patient to patient for being able to work on compliance with respect to those pills. So we're seeing and excited by folks like you coming into healthcare and helping us with these issues. Now, why are they coming? There's always a reason. They don't just come because they want to make a difference to healthcare. Part of it is what you folks have been a part of for many years. Moore's Law is attenuating a little bit. Yes, there's three-dimensional processes. Yes, there's graphene, but it's going to take a while. So there's a little bit of a plateau right now. Faster and smaller is not necessarily the thing you can bring to the plate. So other means of retention, less churn, messaging, gaming, fitness and health. And fitness and health is one of the most sticky and retentive processes you'll have. If your family's health is conduited by these particular devices, you're not going to move very often, or it's going to take longer to actually do it. But we are definitely having a digital health bubble. $4 billion went in last year. This is clearly a bubble. So how do we avoid from making mistakes when you're in a bubble? You have to have not only sensors like these that are accurate, that work, but you actually have to have the process beyond sensors that do something with the data and have very clear business models. These are sexy to put a patch on your chest and have 30 days of it go into the cloud and make sure that they don't come back to the hospital, but it has to have more means to it. So it has to have, once we do this bubble and we get to that unbridled enthusiasm and then harsh reality you've all heard from various folks, you have to have a business model. And the business model has to be a near-term click model, but it also has to have a long-term, and most of those long-term are related to data, and that's where you can get an exponential. And that's what you have to look to these hundreds of digital health companies and disseminate it down to what truly has the ability to integrate into healthcare and has a business model. Because revenue is not something in healthcare to be ashamed of. It actually helps scale and get these technologies into patients more effectively. So this is this device, just from me this morning, and I just wore it after I worked out. And it gives EKG, it gives all sorts of things, blood pressure trends, it gives skin temperature, it gets PO2, how much oxygen is in my blood. Things that are very important if you're a heart failure patient. When you leave the hospital, and we don't want you to come back in 30 days, God bless you, because we get fined if you do. So this lasts for 30 days. Amazing how it's only 30 days. And it beams to the cloud and then comes to the healthcare providers, and they can begin to see if there's trends that are disturbing and potentially threatening that patient to come back to the hospital. Let me give an example of a trial that was done with one of these on. Okay, this is the Samsung device, measuring blood pressure. This is pretty good. This is 4 times a day over 30 days. Okay, that's 120 over 80. It's pretty good. The same acceptable patient who also wore it, but we didn't use it in the trial, but was deemed a success, looked like that. That's not a success. But when they were looked at, when they came into the clinic, they looked like they were 120 over 80. Episodic measurements do not correlate with chronic measurements. You folks all know this from being engineers. Nyquist would roll over in his grave if they saw the way I measured a blood pressure on this gentleman 3 times and I give him a pill for the rest of his life. And guess what? When he goes to another doctor, he's not going to say, well, I'm not going to touch Dr. Fitzgerald's thing. I'm going to just add another pill. We don't have dashboards. We're accelerating in a car without a speedometer. So this is what is going to be brought to really make us do a better job. And if a 56-year-old comes into me and he's a little overweight and he hasn't exercised and his diet's pathetic, I say, change your diet, change your exercise pattern. But I put him on a blood pressure medication anyway. Can you imagine if they do those things? I might be able to take off a pill if I have a dashboard. And that's one of the most important issues that you get. I'm going to end with heart failure really quick. Heart failure is about a $65 billion epic that we see in this country alone. And it is a syndrome. So there's a lot of different issues you need to track. So when you send a patient home, you want to be able to be monitoring these things from activity all the way to their blood pressure, all the way to their respiratory rate, all the way to their SpO2, all the way to their EKG variation, and be able to see when they begin to get in the red. And while they're still at home, before they get hospitalized, 8 to 10 days before, you need to change their regimen. This is what should be shown at the nurse's station for all the heart failure patients that have been discharged the last month. Not that we call them sequentially. Okay, this is what is going to change it. And who's going to pay for this? This particular thing is going to be the hospitals, because this will keep them from being fined, which they are. Remember, today, if you see a patient come back, it's 3% of your annual Medicare bill. That's millions sometimes. So the hospitals will be your issues here. And you can begin to spin the world and look at all those heart failure patients, whether they're in Cincinnati or whether they're in Cancun. And you can begin to look at the predictive nature of how patients do when they're put in selective geographies and covariables, and you can begin to rate how well these people do. And just like Expedia, you can put stars on them. Who's going to pay for this? The insurance company, because it saves them money. But we do better care because now we're standardizing the care between Cincinnati and Cancun. And this is going to be real, and that's the exponential of some of these business models when you have the data. So I'm going to end by looking at Taiwan. Taiwan has 7 million people in it. This is where they get their care today. This is where they're going to get their care tomorrow. They're going to get it at the Cornerstone. They're going to get it at the Lawsons. We're going to get it at the Walgreens, at the Rite Aids, at the Costcos. There's a million of these type of companies, from Heal all the way to True North, building an Uberization, if you will, of healthcare. We're going to bring that to the patients, rather than having the patients go, sit in the emergency room, sitting in the long lines waiting for me. I'm 2 hours late. I'm upset. They're upset. It's not a good mix. So you're going to see this radically change. And that platform of CVS, and we work with CVS, we work with Walgreens, is going to be supported by having an MD, or at least a kiosk with a nurse that can telemed to MD. Blood tests are going to change drastically. Pharmacies are already changing here in Sunnyvale drastically, and these wearables are going to provide the continuum. And this is going to be applicable for the patients that muck up our hospitals. Those are urgent care, preventative, and chronic care. Hospitals will become ICUs again for blood problems, brain problems, and bone problems. All this stuff will be farmed out. So you'll have your kiosk. You'll have your blood test, a drop of blood. I'm not talking about Theranos. I'm talking about what is kindly referred to on the Hill as TKs, Theranos killers. Those are truly getting a drop of blood and being able to get your test instantly in 5 minutes for $3 to $5. That's going to be very important, because you just left the MD kiosk in Walgreens, and then you go over to your pharmacy. Now, how many people go to pharmacies and watch the presbyopia challenged 50-year-old go 2, 4, 6, 8, and then they throw it in a bag and then throw it in a bigger bag? And you go in to try to get your enalapril, and you try to do that within an hour? Good luck. This is going to automate it all. Optical encoding of those pills, not only the right count, the right amount, but the right pill. Because remember, CVS and Walgreens carries the liability if they give you the wrong pill. Outside this country, they're all blister packs. Pharma companies carry the liability, not in this country. So this is going to change the way we distribute pills. So that's the third pedestal. The fourth is going to be wearables, and that's going to provide the continuum of care that's important after you leave that particular source that's going to be at every corner within the next 3 to 5 years. So in conclusion, innovation that we get to see globally is not only thriving, but the ideas and the capital is coming back to the plate. We had a little drought in healthcare for a little while. Everybody got Snapchat friendly. That's changing. MedTech and IT are integrating very fast, from omics to IT to medical technologies. Healthcare variation is a gigantic target for innovation. And then finally, healthcare will change radically in the next 5 years. It'll look more like the retail model at the Walgreens and the CVSs for preventative, urgent, and chronic care. And that's not only going to help the healthcare system save dollars, but most importantly, it's going to help patients be treated more efficiently, and that's why we're in this business. Thank you for your attention.
You seem to be an exception, Dr. Fitzgerald, because all the doctors I know abhor technology. And how is this vision of healthcare? Abhor technology. They hate it.
Abhor, good,
they don't,
because I
they
misunderstood
they don't
what I
even
thought
like
it was a WHO.
abhor, hate, despise. Better? They don't like it.
Yeah.
And they don't even like medical records. They don't like replacing their books with medical records.
Yeah.
So how can you envision healthcare to change radically when you have so much resistance from legacy physicians?
It's a great question, and it's one that I've struggled with for many years because I'm kind of at that age where I had to learn how to do it. But there's built-in incentives. First of all, a lot of physicians now are moonlighting through Health Tap, through patients like me, through a lot of these things that actually help patients. Not all of them are going to convert. And you'll see the 55 and the 60-year-olds that are not. But the plethora of the people below that are. And they're changing not out of necessity. They're actually going to improve their lifestyle, especially if they work in a hospital. They're going to do fewer cases, they're going to do the right cases, and they're going to be able to be paid more and go home earlier. And that incentivizes some of these. Doctors, especially surgeons, are very difficult to get to change. And I understand that because it takes 15, 20 years to perfect that particular art. And I respect that, but they're going to have their life much better. They don't have to do that stuff. Private practitioners, family practices, those are going to be what embrace that, and they're already embracing it through concierge medicine. Pay out of pocket today in the United States is 42%, and it's going to go up, just like we try to get upgrades at every airline. So that part's going to change. It's a different group, though, and they're going to segment. So the people that you're talking about that don't want to change, they're going to be back in the hospital. They're going to be doing focused cases. They're going to make more money. They're going to have a better lifestyle. Now, it'll take a while.
So we're dependent on the younger generation of doctors.
We are. And remember, you know, a young guy at 30 with Watson and other things at his fingertips can figure out the best way to treat that guy's pancreatic cancer. You don't have to go to the 60-year-old that's seen hundreds of them, because we can get hundreds of thousands of records all over the world with the click of a button. Now, how are you going to take care of that and where you're going to go, maybe a different thing, but we have other ways to feature that. It's an evolution. And I agree with you, there are doctors, and when I was talking about this 5 years ago, I was booed. I'm not booed anymore. Not as much. I'm getting used to it. Yeah,
Okay.
sure.
We have a question here.
Dr. Fitzgerald, what do you call it when two existing technologies merge? You've seen it in your own practice. For example, pacemakers being replaced by inductively charged batteries, which I know Stanford invented. What do you call that process?
Coalescence, comes to mind as far as a word, but the word that really reflexes to me is better patient care, because I think that's what's ultimately the best part of it.
Thank you.
Yep.
Last question? Okay.
So I have a question. How do we get the regulatory body to start working with the technology, or the new industry which is evolving as a result?
With the last part?
As a result of the new technologies that are coming about.
You know, this is embarrassing, but I'm on the committee that is mobile health at the FDA. I've been a consultant for the FDA, which is not something you need to be proud of, for the last 25 years. But in particular on the mobile health, you know, you walk into those people, there's 20 of them, they're all around the table, and we're going to have a discussion about smartphones. They all have Nokia flip tops, because that's what the FDA gives them. Of course, I said, hey, I know you got to have a better phone than that. So they all pick out their iPhones. So there is going to be a change here, but what you're seeing is people being more reverent to the FDA than less reverent. 3 years ago, nobody wants to talk about the FDA. It's one of these things. Today, they're setting up a group, and one of the people I'm going to be with, Jeff Shuren, tomorrow in Boston, is really opening up for accelerations and more practical imbibement of these technologies. So they're getting better. They are getting better, but still, it's going to be one of the pipeline issues, just like some of the behavioral issues for some of the doctors, that it's going to limit its rate, which is okay. You don't need it to go that fast. We want to make sure we're doing the right thing here. So I think that governance might be okay. But remember, the young people who use Facebook and vulnerability but trade off speed are going to be the ones that are going to push this, because they're not going to wait for their PSA for 3 days. They're going to push this, and they're going to want that quicker. So it's going to, in some ways, be used around the FDA, and I see that coming, but hopefully not in something that's going to harm patients.
Thank you.
Great.
He just gave us a glimpse of healthcare in 4D, digital devices, diagnostics, and data. Thank you, Dr. Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Doctor. We'll move to the next session, which is a panel discussion. And we have a very wonderful panel who has gathered today to discuss with all of you guys. So before we start, I would request all of the dignitary panel to introduce themselves and your area of specialization for our audiences to know more about yourself.
Sure. So I'm Alex DeWinter with GE Ventures. GE is, of course, the corporate venture capital arm of General Electric. We invest in software technology, healthcare, energy, and advanced manufacturing. I'm on the healthcare side, where we invest in everything besides therapeutics and implants. And I focus specifically on precision medicine, which is life science instrumentation and clinical diagnostics.
I am Sanjeet Dang, Investment Director at Intel Capital. For those of you who are not familiar with Intel Capital, that's the venture arm of Intel, the company. We are among the largest investors, not just corporate investors, we're among the largest investors, because we spend around $400 million every year, not fund size every year. And Intel is a horizontal company selling into pretty much every vertical that counts, and hence Intel Capital mirrors that strategy as well. Healthcare is one of our focus areas as well, but more from a big data standpoint.
I'm Mark Goldberg. I'm the grumpy Bostonian. I have been involved in the healthcare industry for almost 35 years, starting out in the biotech sector, and then for the last 17 years as one of the co-founders of a venture capital and private equity firm in Boston called BioVentures Investors. We do only healthcare investment, and while we started out more in the therapeutic area, our focus today is almost exclusively devices, diagnostics, and IT.
Thank you. And again, before we started this session, as I mentioned about definition of a digital health, just for everybody's one more time of interpretation, let me explain that our discussion here would be related to the 3 dimensions of digital health. One is medical devices, which includes wearables. The second one is precision medicine, which includes genomics, still pharmacovigilance, and digital drug discovery. And then the third dimension is connected health, which includes electronic medical records and the patient insights. So while we are looking at digital health, one of the most interesting factor that I wanted to discuss with you, and what I found was in 2014, around $4 billion were invested pertaining to the new companies, like as the seed funding, as well as Series A, as well as Series B, I would say. And half of that money was invested in Bay Area when it comes to the digital health as one of the business segment. So for this year, what are your thoughts? I mean, first of all, is that $4 billion number itself is like correct, or if that's truth, then can you just help us understand more about the investment scenarios?
Oh, I'll go first. Well, I think one of the challenges is around definition of digital health. If you look at Rock Health and Startup Health, which are two of the organizations which do a lot of the collating of digital health and digital health investments, I mean, we GE loves both of those organizations. I would say, however, that they take a fairly liberal view of the definition of digital health, including a lot of things that probably I think most people would not qualify as digital health. So I think those numbers are a slight overestimate. They both organizations say that over $10 billion, I mean $4 billion last year, but over $10 billion over the last 4 years has gone in cumulatively. At least by those metrics, I think the trend is going to continue, but I do think those numbers are slightly overstated.
I actually tend to agree. Somewhere the numbers are a little overstated. I do have good cautious optimism about healthcare in general, or if I may say healthcare IT, you can call it digital health, whatever, but use of digital technology in healthcare. I think that sector is at an inflection point, but again, we have talked about that for so many years. I still feel there needs to be a pervasive reach of sensors first to get more continuous monitoring of patients rather than just trying to push an IT solution and go to the hospitals and start shoving it down their throat. Till at a fundamental level, a patient doesn't realize that, hey, I have to wear a wearable for my health reasons, I think digital health will remain a dream. And I've seen a lot of startups trying to attack this area. Wearables, like I mentioned, is one of the focus areas we'll talk about. So it's all fascinating. It all sounds great, wearing technology in your hand or as glasses. But once you start designing those wearables specifically for healthcare, you're actually forgetting that you're designing it for consumers who are used to the experience of an iPhone, experience of an iWatch, or other such devices which were not designed for healthcare. So step one, when we talk of health innovation, has to be the deeper understanding of what entices a consumer to adopt a technology. And we have invested in wearable devices companies as well. Basis Science is, I call it a BioWatch. We invested in it, and Intel ended up acquiring the company within 1 year of investment. And it was a great exit, but the usage patterns were still not that strong, were still not that compelling. And that's where the fundamental problem is. So we can talk about $4 billion correct or not, but I think we still need to see that aha technology that says, okay, I'm going to drive adoption in with a different angle, still targeting healthcare as the eventual goal, but come in from a different angle and appeal to the consumers and then get traction. And then once you have those sensors, if 80% of the people here today would be wearing a BioWatch, any BioWatch, doctors would be compelled to use that data in real time. That's when innovation in digital health will start going up the curve. Insurance agencies will say, shit, that's data sitting there. Why am I not using it for predicting when the patient will have is going to have a heart attack? Should I have the doctor start calling the patient and saying, hey, you want to come in for a check? So those are the things. I think there are steps here that need to happen versus just trying to drive the big data or IoT, IT technologies and just modifying them for healthcare.
The problem with being old is you've seen this before. And this is just the new buzzword as far as I'm concerned. We've seen a lot of crazes. We've been through genomics, proteomics. Before that, we've been through combinatorial chemistry. Before that, there was something else. People are trying to cram whatever they can into the new term. So looking at what the total dollar volume is of investment, for me, is meaningless. It really comes down to what are the actual investments being made in, what are the products, and then a whole series of questions after that.
But still, the investment patterns are always related to the type of product the companies are trying to make. I mean, if you're looking at health tech companies or the med tech companies, then probably those are related or those are compared similar to any other tech company where probably you require less amount of seed funding to get off the ground versus the conventional biotech companies or drug discovery companies where the amount of funding that they require is like humongous. So from that perspective, you know, if you're looking at digital health has split into 3 areas, and you know, Sanjeet gave a good perspective about the wearable side of it, which also talks about a little bit of the connected health aspect. But coming back to the precision medicine, I mean, today if you really say that if the digital health is at the inflection point, I would say that maybe the consumer awareness of genetics is at the inflection point where there is not
has been for I don't know how many years.
Sure, but if you are now looking at any of the news item or any of the references, people are talking about DNA like so casually, I mean so easily, the way it was not there earlier, and that is where if the DNA within the people is now coming to their tongues and discussions so easily, the information associated with the genetics or the genomics, as Dr. Peter was also mentioning about the omics aspect. So omics is playing a significant role in the drug discovery development or the research and discovery side of it. So Mark, maybe my question to you is that how do you see the IT or the enablement of omics through different IT tools is really helping the drug discovery or the digital drug discovery, one can say?
So I'm going to step back for a moment because I think you have to put this into a context. And the context sort of goes back to what Peter eloquently talked about. But I'm going to take it even a step above that and go at 10,000 feet for a second. You've got to look at 2 or 3 critical elements happening in healthcare. The first is very simply, worldwide you're dealing with an aging population where more healthcare has to be delivered more efficiently. So efficiency is key. So before you even look at any of the omics or any of the techniques, you've got to look at that. You've also got 2 other major trends happening. You have a major trend that's been happening. In fact, it's the biggest surprise that happened that I experienced post the Affordable Care Act. I thought the Affordable Care Act would lock in a lot of the payment systems. Just the opposite. We're dealing with a trend right now where payment is going from fee-for-service to capitation. People are being paid to manage populations, and how you think about that and how you manage that is absolutely key. And at the same time, you're also dealing with a world which is going to more personalized, predictive, and preventative medicine. So those are how it all fits in there together. From that standpoint, if you look at all of the technologies, the question then becomes, how do you do something that fits into those specific needs? And most importantly, how do you do something that is clinically relevant? There's a lot of information out there. You can be tested for an awful lot, but with most things you can't do anything about clinically. So does it have clinical relevance is critically important. And you have to follow the money. Can you get paid for this? So is it useful? And can you get paid? Is it better will the patient use it? Will the doctors adopt it? And who's going to pay for it? So if you then look at all of that, you can begin to see a whole series of things happening in the clinical setting. In my mind, when you look at quote-unquote digital health historically, you can see things that have come along that have been extraordinarily useful. For me, the advent of digital imaging was one of the biggest breakthroughs because you were able to translate images into transmittable data, and then you were able to enhance it through computer algorithms to do things that were extraordinarily better than what was there before and clinically useful. As you move forward, you're being able to see a whole series of uses of information throughout the system that all fit into that trend line. So to answer your more specific question, if you look at drug development, for example, there were 2 or 3 major trends that are happening because of quote-unquote digital health. One is you are being able to do much better drug discovery. Peter mentioned that. You're also able to do much more efficient drug work because you can use data to design clinical trials much more efficiently. Who's your patient population, and can you kill it early? Because, by the way, killing stuff early is really important. Those things are being enhanced. But overall, you have to be able to look at this not as, a specific technology, but really, how does this tool enhance your ability to produce products that fit the major trends that are emerging?
I'll add a venture capital perspective to this. And you have to step out of the healthcare sector here for a second. Venture capitalists have a window in terms of how they can invest. Number one, they're actually fund managers. They're responsible for investing somebody else's money. Most VC firms have limited partners who have invested in the VC firms. So the general partner has a very strong responsibility in terms of how to invest. And he or she is responsible for generating returns on that investment. So it's a very financial return-driven process. When we make investment decisions, that is the key goal we are trying to achieve. I would love to say we like to make social impact, create jobs, and everything else. That's not number one goal, in all honesty. And number two, once you start talking of areas like drug discovery, a startup, particularly in initial stages, seed or Series A stage, typically has cash runway, for 1 or 2 years. You'll run out of your cash before you can get an FDA approval, like I think you alluded to as well. So in that scenario, keeping in mind how venture capitalists are expected to invest, plus the time frame it can take some of the healthcare startups, drug discovery being a case study here, keeping both of those points, it's very hard to envision how startups can really flourish. Because as investors, we invest in so many areas. Let's say retail analytics. I'm just picking one area. If I invest in a retail analytics seed stage company, 10% team, 5% team, I'm expecting within the next 1 year, they'll get to 2 POCs with retailers, and then the year after, they'll start getting into 2 or 3 production, and hopefully early revenue will start flowing in. That's a curve, and then they'll start to raise Series A, $10 million round, with some early revenue already in place. That's a very normal venture capital curve, expectation of a startup's curve. In some areas within healthcare, it's hard to drive that. And you also have to look at the government angle here. Healthcare is a regulated market for very good reasons. But it is a highly regulated market. It's a huge market. I forget the numbers, but 17% of the GDP goes towards healthcare. But it's despite that kind of spending, let's say $3 trillion a year, very little part of that spending actually goes towards digital innovation or IT innovation because of those reasons. And that means innovation gets stifled in this environment. And in that environment, when VCs look at, or even new startups, entrepreneurs look at what's going to be my next startup, or VCs look at which is the next area I'm going to focus on, they're first looking at the track record, looking back. They first start asking the question of how many exits have happened in healthcare in the last 3 years. Because that's their first question. Before they invest, they're thinking of selling. Like it or not. It might sound funny, but that's how VCs think. Oh, Uber became such a big company, 51 billion valuation last round. Oh shit, crowdsourcing is the next big thing. I better invest in it. Like it or not, it's a herd mentality. And Uber was passed by people who were early investors in Google. They said, car? Taxis? Who invests in that? But anyways, my point is, you have to keep all of those angles in mind. You have to keep a VC's and investors' angle in mind as well. What drives him or her when you talk about innovation in healthcare?
Sure, but then again, Alex, since you have a dedicated focus on the healthcare investments, as Sanjit is saying that if you have an option of cloud, non-IT, non-healthcare IT solution businesses or the product businesses versus medical devices or the technology businesses which are pertaining to the healthcare. Since you have a dedicated focus on the healthcare side of the investments, how do you see this challenge from the entrepreneurial perspective? That they are trying to build something which probably is a breathtaking medical device that they're trying to build, but then the type of hurdles that they face, and on the top of it, FDA. I mean, that's another thing. I think Sanjeev also asked that as a question, that FDA will always be questioning about the new innovations in this whole industry, because it actually goes and hurt patients straight away, and that's where they are more conscious about it. What kind of disruptive technology that you are trying to build. So how do you select the type of companies that you invest, or what kind of areas that you would advise? Is an area of probably the interest here in this market.
Yeah. So, well, to Mark's point, so first of all, I look at life science instrumentation and clinical diagnostics. Some of those could be considered to be digital health. Certainly, Startup Health and Rock Health, we consider those digital health. I tend to think of them as something different, but that's okay. When I think of diagnostics, to Mark's point, one of the things he was mentioning is clinical utility. So how do doctors use the data? Do they actually change the decisions they're making based on the result they get back from the test? That's something very important to think about. Certainly, as you are developing healthcare-based startups, the point is sort of a so what question. So the doctor gets a result back. So what? I think that question is not always such a hurdle for a lot of more clinically focused startups. For some of the more consumer genomics-based startups, that's certainly a question. So a patient finds out, they give their spit sample to 23andMe and they find out that their eyes are blue. I think they probably could have turned that, figured that out themselves. Or that their earwax is, dry versus wet. That's also interesting, but probably irrelevant. One of the other points I always consider is health economics. The healthcare system, because a lot of clinical diagnostics, the majority of clinical diagnostics are paid for by the healthcare system, either by insurers, payers, Medicare, the government. They are not interested in just sort of layering on more cost to the system. They always want to see how ultimately your test, in the case of a clinical diagnostic, how your test can ideally save the healthcare system money. Sometimes it can do that, for example, by suggesting a pool of patients who would otherwise be shunted into an expensive treatment, suggesting which patients don't necessarily need that expensive treatment. So that's sort of comes out to find a way that the test can arbitrage and gets paid for the value it brings to the system. In life science instrumentation, things we are always looking for are sort of precise biological measurements, disruptive innovation. One thing I'd say in general, in terms of how to go about being a healthcare entrepreneur, I think in some sense you do have to be a little bit less hinged than most other entrepreneurs. I mean, I think there was an interesting New York Times article a few years ago saying that at least some venture capitalists, I'm not sure if I'm exactly of this opinion, but some venture capitalists think the best entrepreneurs are actually crazy, actually have a few screws loose. I think in healthcare that may be especially the case, because what you're trying to take on is this enormous monolithic, very resistant to change organization. And most of the healthcare startups are deliberately trying to change something which is, resists all change in order to sort of benefit human health and also do well while doing good. That's quite a daunting task. So I think you have to, if you're a healthcare entrepreneur, you have to be extremely motivated, not take no for an answer. So go for it.
Thank you. Mark, you have any thoughts on this? Because I think, you also have seen such kind of companies, and I'm sure you would have your own views to share.
Fortunately, I think most of my entrepreneurs are not unhinged. I do think they're incredibly driven. I do think the thing that they totally understand is those of us in the venture capital community are middlemen. We take money from LPs. We have to give them back more. I have a French investor who always says to me, Mark, it's about the piles. I give you a pile of money, you give me a bigger pile back. That's what it's about. So how do you do that in the healthcare world? What you're really doing is you're creating products that are truly innovative, that are great leaps forward. Peter mentioned one of them, which is the ability to replace an aortic valve through the femoral artery. I'm very pleased that one of my partners is a co-inventor of that. He mentioned, for example, that there's a need for PSA testing, not to take 3 days. That's not being driven by young people wanting it faster. It's actually being driven by the doctors, because they're driven crazy by the fact they have to reacquire the files, track down the patient, and because of HIPAA, have to talk to the patient, not the spouse. When we convened a panel of urologists 5 years ago and said, hey, what's your biggest issue? They said, we do so many PSA tests, not because it's a GP PSA test, annual physical, but if you've got a diagnosis, you're following PSA acceleration every 3 months. How do we do this? Not in 3 days, but in 10 minutes? That 10-minute PSA test already exists. It was developed by one of our companies. Happy to say, it was a nice return. Why is it a nice return, and why does healthcare investing make sense? Because ultimately, if you think about the major companies that are out there, what they have done is they have outsourced R&D. And it's the entrepreneurial companies that's providing the new product flow. And as a result, if you can create something that truly is innovative, that really shifts something, can you shift an operation from 3.5 hours in the operating suite in a heart-lung bypass machine to 40 minutes in the cath lab? Can you shift a 3-day test to a 10-minute test in the doctor's office? Those products are products that people want to acquire. They especially want to acquire them if you're first. That's important. And if you can do it in a capital-efficient manner, this is an area where you can make a fair amount of money. Now, I have no experience in the non-healthcare world. But what I can tell you is that collectively we've done something like 28, 29 deals in the last decade. To date, 22 of them have come full cycle. 80% of them have worked. And our collective IRR is somewhere in the mid-20%. I'll stack that up against any other VC anywhere in the world.
Wonderful. So here, now that we are talking about medical devices at large, wearable devices, which is one of the very attractive motivation for new entrepreneurs to start thinking about the wearable devices and collecting the data from that, and also eventually telemedicine, which is another dimension of connected health. How do you see wearable devices playing a role, and starting from the Fitbit versus Apple Watch, where it is not intended for healthcare data, but it can still be used as additional feature? I mean, how do you see that whole spectrum getting evolved?
I touched upon it a little bit earlier as well. I think the wearable devices have to first appeal to the consumer so that the consumer buys the device and actually uses it for months and months, versus buying a device and it's a cool device to wear and uses it for a month or two and then it stays away somewhere in the home.
I would just like to differentiate between the good to have versus must to have device. So it's like, as Peter was also saying, that if I want to quantify the blood pressure, then I'm going to use that device. Or even for the ECG signals, I'm going to use that device on my chest. So those are something which are like, must to have for that patient health care, versus, having a device and just counting my heart rate, even if it doesn't make a difference to me. I mean, that's kind of a thing. So how do you see that market getting evolved?
Yeah, so let's break down the market into number one, doctor-mandated wearable device versus consumer-initiated wearable device. Doctor-mandated wearable device is like the patient will have to wear it, he or she likes the device or not. The doctor is monitoring that data, hopefully on a daily basis, even when I'm home, and hence I have to wear it. I think that market has a lot of potential because there is already a forcing function, and I know I have a chronic problem, and I have to monitor it per the doctor's verdict, pretty much. So user doesn't really have a choice, and user obviously still can be lazy and not wear it. Even that happens. I go home like I'm not wearing it, whatever. Yes, that can happen as well, but as long as it prevents me from going into the hospital for monitoring and say, okay, I can do this at the leisure of my home, I can see a value proposition for the patient to wear that. The other part, which is what I was actually talking about earlier, is more consumer-initiated buying of wearable devices. Those have to be first cool devices and then help me on my healthcare part. So, and that's the second part. I'm not sure yet if we are there in terms of market really taking off. There have been devices that have tried well, iWatch, etc., but even iWatch is successful not for healthcare reasons. And that's where I was going, that you have to appeal to the consumers. And I feel even if you can bring that mentality into the first type of devices, the doctor-mandated devices, it will actually help adoption. So that's the kind of thinking we need to drive mass adoption. You might still be able to create a niche market for the doctor-mandated devices, and the patient will wear it for as long as the doctor says you have to wear it. But after that, it's gone off the curve again.
So I previously to being at GE, I was at another venture firm called Moore Davidow, and we actually invested in a couple of wearables. One of them is kind of an interesting case example. It's a company called Corventis, which made a mobile heart monitor, basically a little patch similar to the one Peter was showing. You wear it on your heart. The interesting thing is it wasn't a new-to-world device. It was basically a replacement device for another device called a Holter monitor. Maybe some people here have worn them. When you go into a physician complaining, or an emergency room typically, complaining about heart palpitations, they will suspect perhaps you have an atrial fibrillation, which is a serious disorder and needs to be treated if that's actually what you have. In order to figure out if you have that, they would put a Holter monitor on you, which is like this 12-lead system. You can't wear it in the shower. You can wear it for 24 hours. The problem is during those 24 hours, that atrial fibrillation would have to recur in order for the doctor to be able to track it and find out that you actually have that problem and then treat it. What actually happens is patients will go home with this device for 24 hours, come back. Most of the time, the doctor doesn't actually see that same signature on their heart. So what Corventis did is they came along and they said, we're going to make a patch. It's much smaller to wear. It's as accurate as a Holter monitor, or close to as accurate as a Holter monitor. Difference is now you can wear it for 2 weeks. During that entire 2 weeks, you're being tracked. And at the end of that 2 weeks, if you've had an atrial fibrillation during that time, the doctor will actually see it and will then know exactly what to do in order to treat the patient. Corventis was actually bought by Medtronic, which actually viewed the company as an interesting funnel, a customer acquisition funnel because Medtronic makes a lot of the devices that are used to treat atrial fibrillation. So they thought, well, if we buy Corventis, then we'll be able to basically increase the funnel for patient acquisition for us. So that's on the medical side. I think there are a lot of wearables which are sort of taking more of that approach on the clinical side, which is basically there are these clunky devices that are currently used with sort of 80s or 70s technology. We can use much more cool and much more sort of futuristic and miniaturized technology to mimic a lot of the same functionality in a way that's much less intrusive. I think on the more consumer-facing wearable side, I actually own a baseless watch. I'm not wearing it right now, you might notice, because the metrics it measures are skin temperature, which is, I mean, really, like my skin temperature doesn't matter at all. It measures how sweaty I am, again, not very interesting, although it was kind of interesting to find out that I sweat a lot at night sometimes, so that's maybe TMI. It measures how much I move, which is kind of interesting, although you can get that from a pedometer, and I sort of always have a sense of how much I move anyway. And then measured heart rate, which was sort of interesting for the first week, and then I sort of knew what my heart rate was anyway. So, you have this interesting case of that's, I think, very much at this point, a healthcare tracking monitor, or sort of a wellness monitor. Which is useful. I think it's probably useful for people who are much more serious about their athletic ability than I am. But then you have, interestingly, you have sort of Apple coming out with a watch which has some of that functionality, but then it has a lot more of the consumer-facing functionality, which I would suspect means that when people buy it, they're using it because you can now text on it. You can do other things with the watch other than just sort of tracking these interesting biometrics.
Sure, and again, when we are talking about different lab instruments or even the medical devices or even different databases, it collects the data in different format. And if you look at the medical industry as a whole or a biomedical industry as a whole, we still have those silos, where the data is still kind of structured in silos, and probably each of the one compartment is not probably talking to another compartment, and that's where big data is another such word being very often used now when it comes to the healthcare, that how can you have big data analytics and visualization and insights into that. So what is your opinion about use of big data as a global term, I would say, and from the healthcare perspective? And how do you see that as a market? Because medical devices is still a specialized area which requires
XYZ kind of a knowledge, whereas big data is where you are really trying to enable lots of insights and a lot of data analytics from the healthcare perspective.
All right, I'll start on this one, but I'm happy to hand off the microphone. So I think the era of big data in healthcare is starting right now. You see it a couple places, for example, Flatiron, which is a notable company which raised over $100 million from Google, among others, is trying to use big data to effectively combine a number of small-scale, effectively clinical trials on cancer patients to collect all that data and be able to say, okay, we have a cancer patient came in with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The patient is 54-year-old male, this particular weight. Let's see if we can find other patients exactly like this patient. Let's see if we can figure out all the different ways these patients who fit exactly into the same demographic bucket, how they were all treated, exactly the same stage, and let's see which ones had the best outcomes. And from that, we can actually figure out how best to treat this patient. So that's one application of big data. Obviously, the rise of genomics with the terabytes of data that are coming off of each genome is another potential application of big data. You have now companies like Craig Venter's Human Longevity based in San Diego, which is trying to basically do a land grab to grab as much data as they can about as many people as they can. The idea being somewhat similar to Flatiron, but except for now for all medical conditions, which is if we can find 1 million patients, we can find, let's say, a small fraction of them who develop rheumatoid arthritis. Is there something in their genomes that said, how they responded to a particular treatment, or something in some of their other phenotypic data, which explains how they might respond to data or how their disease might develop? So you have Nant Health, you have Flatiron, Human Longevity. All of those companies are sort of just in their early stages of development, I would say, of applying big data to actually have meaningful outcomes in healthcare. Perhaps there are examples where it actually has come out, but I haven't seen it yet.
To add to the list, the other area within healthcare we have seen big data in healthcare succeed is where you can reduce the hospital's cost. Predictive analytics, for example, readmission rate. Hospitals are really driven by how can they reduce their costs, because they're always under pressure to improve care and reduce some of their infrastructure costs. And also, if a patient has to be admitted back after 2 days, that's a huge cost hit to the hospital. So we have seen startups looking at patient data and helping the nurse in the night shift, for example, and saying, hey, out of the 10 patients that you're monitoring, these are the 2 that are at highest risk for readmission based on the data we see, based on the signals we see. So that's another area, in addition to the list Alex mentioned, where we have seen some innovation or application of big data analytics.
I would agree with all that, and I think particularly in the pharmaceutical area, you're going to end up with big data really driving a very different approach in how you discover new therapeutics. It's certainly driving a different approach in how you design your clinical trial, what patients you select, and monitoring their progress. It's also doing something else. It's helping to address previously intractable problems. I'll give you one example. All of you saw last week the new American Cancer Society recommendations on mammograms. What's the big issue there? It's actually it's not dissimilar to what's happening in the prostate area. We're able to diagnose so much more than we could before, but we can't differentiate something that's really going to cause a problem from something that's what's known as indolent. It's not going to progress. Big data is going to help solve that key oncology issue. If you have something that used to scare us to death because it was precancerous or cancerous, big data is going to help us over time be able to say, we now know whether or not we have something that needs to be treated or not treated. And that's going to make a huge difference in the practice of medicine.
Sure. And before we end, we can't end this discussion without discussing about US FDA, right? I mean, because that's healthcare being such a heavily regulated industry, every venture has one of the risk factor of how is this whole venture will be seen by FDA. Could it be from the 510K perspective or the pre-market approval perspective, or even from the research side, you're talking about a lot of compliances that are required. So when you are trying to make a decision about investments into any of the company which is on the medical technology or the digital health, as one can say, how do you quantify that risk of dependency on US FDA regulations?
Me? Well, so most of the digital health companies we look at have very little FDA risk. I would say one of them we invested in, Chronotherapeutics, does have some. The interesting thing there, what this one is it's a watch or a wearable, which helps patients quit smoking. And the way it does that is it actually has a little cartridge inside, which at specific time intervals will dose the patient with nicotine, so it's effectively an intelligent nicotine patch. Recognizes what time of the day patients typically have cravings and doses them preemptively before they have cravings. So theoretically prevents the patient from ever wanting that cigarette. That one does have a FDA path. We invested in it nonetheless, partially because the drug that it's using isn't a novel drug, so it doesn't have to go through clinical testing. Nicotine is, granted, it's a terrible poison, but everybody recognizes that it's appropriate for use as a smoking cessation treatment. And then also partially just because effectively it was an engineering problem. So it's an engineering problem to figure out how to dose the nicotine properly and then take it through FDA. It will be a 510K clearance, I think, a drug device combination. For the most part, most of the other than that, the digital health companies we invest in are not typically going through FDA. I would say one thing that, again, Peter mentioned, that's really been playing out very publicly is Theranos' troubles with the FDA and with reality in general. But they have we're sort of making these grand claims about the parameters, about sort of what they could do in terms of taking a very small amount of blood and measuring a certain number of metrics. And it's becoming increasingly clear that not only is some of that not true, but they also didn't go through the proper regulatory authorities. They actually, if you look at their board, it's stacked with these super powerful people from government. My only assumption is that they were planning to basically get some sort of workaround with the FDA, so they wouldn't have to go through the FDA. That obviously didn't happen, and the FDA is now cracking down on them. So maybe the lesson is you sort of ignore the FDA at your peril if you're likely to have a regulated device.
I really hope the Theranos story doesn't come crashing down because that's actually going to bring down a lot of potential healthcare startups. Investors are going to look at it like, oh, see, this is what happens. And it'll be unfortunate. But to the earlier point about FDA approvals, so our thesis in healthcare is more from a compute perspective, looking at this, number one, from a devices angle standpoint. Wearables, we look at wearables as the next wave of computing. And can Intel company create a thesis and drive its CPU penetration in that market? And before that market really forms, have a play in it. So one part of our healthcare investment thesis is along the wearables line for that angle. Second is, like I mentioned, along the lines of big data analytics. So we really believe in big data from both an infrastructure as well as an application standpoint. And we have invested in quite a few companies at an infrastructure level, Hadoop, Cloudera, MongoDB, NoSQL database, etc. But infrastructure is great. You still need verticalized applications. And hence, we have looked at investments in financial technology, e-commerce, healthcare, and so on. And that's the second angle of our investment thesis in healthcare, big data-based healthcare technologies. So in both of those, we typically stay away from FDA approvals.
I don't even know where to start. Quick comment on our favorite disgraced company. I actually think it's good for healthcare investment. It's all about the data. And if you have something that doesn't have good data, it shouldn't succeed, period. Good companies are going to succeed. Companies that produce good products with good data historically have always succeeded. So in my mind, this is just playing out as it should. Secondly, the FDA has a role to play and a job to do. And it's critically important to recognize that's what they do. They're not the enemy. They're part of the process. And in fact, if you have a good FDA, a sane FDA, an FDA based upon looking at things in a stable and predictable manner, it actually increases the confidence of the consumer And it actually increases the confidence of the investor because you know what the pathway is. So from my standpoint, anyway, the more you understand the process, the more you're in communication, the more it's a non-issue. From our standpoint, we always look at what the regulatory process is. We know what we're getting into, we factor it in, and we make sure that that's part of the pathway, and it's not an issue.
How long will it take to get there, especially where I am, and my personal experience has been pretty dismal?
My prediction is it'll take shorter than you imagine, because the financial incentives are huge. If you think about it, the question is, how long will it take to get some of these technologies adopted in the general population? Using his own annual physical as an example. And if you think about a system in which increasingly physicians are being paid to keep you healthy, and it's all about efficiency, the drive to create an efficient system is going to be accelerating. And anything that helps get them there is going to help be adopted because it has to be from an economic driving standpoint.
Hi, I think there's some different incentives with going to an outcome-based model of funding healthcare, where an outcome is defined differently with different timeframes. So can you talk about some of the different business models that'll have to be innovated with for healthcare particularly?
Anyone want to tackle that one?
Well, one nice example is I think a lot of the business models are probably going to be somewhat similar to see in other areas. One thing that's sort of interesting is you're starting to see some risk-sharing models. A company we just invested in called Omada, in particular, does have an interesting risk-sharing model where the company tries to identify or take patients who are pre-diabetic and prevent them from becoming fully diabetic. It goes through its coaching program to have them lead healthier lives and actually, on average, gets them to lose 5 to 8% of their weight, which in turn prevents them from getting type 2 diabetes, which in turn prevents the healthcare system from absorbing higher costs associated with taking care of diabetic patients. What they do is they basically say, healthcare system, we've identified one of your patients, or you're going to send us one of your patients who's pre-diabetic, pay us a little bit up front. If your patient loses weight, pay us a little bit more. And if your patient loses a lot of weight, pay us the full fee. If they don't lose any weight, you've only paid us that little bit up front. Effectively, that's a risk-sharing model where the company is not really making any money if they don't work out. But if they do work out, then they get paid their full amount. So you might see more of that coming forward as insurers are a little more careful with where they spend their money with a lot of these new digital health models.
Okay, great. So thank you so much, Alex, Sanjeet, and Mark, for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you. Now, after this, we have our next guest speaker, Wayne McDonnell from PwC. I would invite Wayne to the stage, please. Wayne has over 25 years of experience in the life sciences operations, supply chain, and related technologies. And his experience spans around pharmaceutical, biotech, and the medical devices industries. So over to Wayne.
Excellent. Well, I'd like to start by thanking TIE for having me tonight. I want to tell you why I'm definitely going to come back, hopefully, as long as this next 30 minutes or so works out well. In my first 30 minutes here, first of all, I was one of the people that raised their hand at the beginning. It was my first time ever being here at this event. In my first 30 minutes, I met 5 new friends, I tried some new food, and I had a fascinating healthcare-focused discussion amongst those new friends as to whether we would give up sex or bacon if it made us more healthy. I've never had that discussion at any conference, so I'm definitely coming back to see what the follow-on discussion is all about. But maybe, I think really to illustrate the points that we've been making tonight, to start out with a personal story. Amongst the children that I have a set of identical twins. And one of them has had ulcerative colitis for the last 8 years. So he's very, very attuned to his own personal health. Thinks about it all the time, researches health topics all the time. But even though only one of the twins has a disease like that, they both have a common teenager ailment called acne. So last year, when the one guy who has ulcerative colitis came to us and said, I've got a skin disease, we looked at him and we said, you don't have a skin disease, you're not taking care of your acne like we told you, go back upstairs and do your homework. And he persisted, I have a skin disease. So we took him to the doctors. But we laughed the whole way, from the time we got in the car to the time we got in the doctor's office, because he thought he's diagnosed himself with this skin disease. And we're laughing in the doctor's office, not like great parents, explaining to the doctor why we're laughing. She looked at us and she said, well, what did he tell you that he has? And we told her. She looked at him, she looked at us, and she goes, he's exactly right. So he had spent an hour or so on the internet and all sorts of websites looking up what his particular skin disease could be, and he was right. But what strikes me about all the discussion that we've been having tonight, and I know all the related discussions that we have, is what if we not only had the tools to look up on the internet and try to self-diagnose this disease, but what if we had tools that would have allowed us as parents to take action even sooner, not to wait for day 3 or 5 or whatever it was for him to come to us? What if we had tools that allow us to interact with our doctor, our primary care doctor, sooner? What if we could have avoided going to the doctor's office at night and picking up the prescription at a pharmacy, et cetera, et cetera? So I think that's just one example of really what we've been talking about, right? How multiple disruptions, if you will, are all coming together at once and really changing how we not only think about, but how we interact with healthcare and the healthcare environment day in and day out. So I'll try to make a couple points here tonight that really, I think, kind of put a wrapper on some of the things that we've been talking about. One of the first things that I'd like to mention here is that, and the point was made on the panel discussion, we have to stop thinking about the silos of healthcare, whether it's a silo around innovation, a silo around manufacturing, a silo around payers, a silo around providers, now a silo around some other areas that we'll talk about in a second. But there's multiple things happening here from both a global megatrends perspective as well as what's happening specifically to healthcare. First of all, if we haven't noticed, we're all getting older. If that's not the case, at least the doctors are getting much younger. I don't know which is really happening there. But we're all getting older. We're all moving around a lot. As we move around the world more, we're becoming a more diverse population. We as consumers, as individuals, we're getting empowered. We're getting all that information. We're getting the ability to think about our healthcare on our own, to make our own decisions. We're taking more responsibility, but we're demanding better care. How? Well, one of the ways is because we're utilizing all of these social, mobile, analytical, and all these collaborative technologies that are all around us. We mentioned new entrants, and I think they are really a big impact to some of the big trends that are going to affect us here, both as consumers of healthcare and the healthcare industry. And really then when you think about us as a population, we're really starting to demand care anywhere. And not just healthcare, but that point about whether it's health cure or just health in general, okay? We're shifting the dynamic here. And really to solve some of these problems and to deliver on care anywhere or health cure anywhere, again, we have to start thinking about that collaborative environment and not silos. Kind of think about the 4 pillars that Dr. Fitzgerald mentioned in his talk there. We've been talking about sensors and wearables and their impact. Again, I think that demonstrates here and really drives home the point that we're talking about a multi-stakeholder environment that's required here in order to make the wearable work, in order to take advantage of the data, in order to make the patient better. But where are some of the disruptions that we're talking about? Well, first, the sensor on its own is a technological disruptor, right? I mean, if we didn't have that sensor, the ability to capture data and interact with us as the patients, we wouldn't be talking about that level of healthcare, type of healthcare, and this ecosystem. But then when you think about it, if you're wearing that sensor, you're able to detect what's happening with the drug-eluting stent, for example, that's actually delivering some medication to you. You need some sort of device, and most often now it's our iPhones that we're going to use to be able to collect that data. So now we've got a technical disruption and a digital disruption. In one sense, it is kind of delivering on this notion of personalized medicine that we've been talking about now for how long, right? I mean, we're making now through the use of the technical disruption, the digital disruption, and now applications, we're making healthcare really personal. And last but not least, and this is, I think, what a good chunk of the panel discussion really hit on here, why is all this really important to us? We're not only going to get the data for better information and for better care, there's a whole segment of this collaborative ecosystem that really wants to make sure that they're getting value for what either they're investing in or paying in for us as patients and as consumers. So I see now, we're moving from the state where we had multiple independent forces that are now really, they're not coming together anymore, they've come together. We can't talk about silos anymore. We've got to talk about the ecosystem. We've got to figure out how to make the ecosystem work. And I'd submit to you the next level of innovation is not around the individual disruptors. It really is around making this ecosystem work and come alive. But it's got to come alive one bite at a time. You may have read in my bio, I don't come from healthcare specifically. I come from the industry. So I've spent the first 20 years of my career in the pharmaceutical, the biotech, the med device industry. I've spent a little time as an industry analyst, so I'm dangerous because I think I have some good opinions every now and then, which may or may not be true. But I think about this whole discussion about volume and value, and what's going to win out, and how long is it going to take for value to really win out in this discussion. In terms of 2014 dollars, right? You think about the top 3 selling bio or pharmaceutical products in 2014. About how much in annual revenue do you think the top 3 grossed? Ballpark. I've seen some numbers, it's at least 30 billion. Depending on which report and how you group it, it might be as big as 50 billion. Now, you have to ask yourself, how much did it cost to create and to bring those top 3 medicines to the market, right? It's not 30 billion, but it's a lot of money still. Well, are we getting the benefit? Right? What kind of return on our investment did we get, really, when you think about effectiveness? Well, if the top 3 drugs grossed over 30 billion in 2014, what percentage of the patients who took those top 3 drugs responded favorably? Anyone want to guess? I've seen numbers that it could be as few as maybe 40%. Some say maybe as high as 50 or 60. What does that really mean? That means, well, we've taken all that money that it costs to discover, to develop, and bring those drugs to the market. We've got a benefit for 50% of the people. I think there's a really good question to ask here. First of all, how long are we as patients going to accept this whole dynamic of volume, over value? As investors, we like it, right? We hold stock in companies that discover and develop drugs and products. We'll take the volume, part of that equation for now. But people who are demanding health cure and care everywhere, that scale is going to tip over time. So we've got this disruption here that's really going to continue as we make better use of digital technologies, better use of data and analytics. Well, what if that patient, when they walk through the door, at the care center, what if we knew through the use of digital technologies, through the use of big data, what if we knew which treatment that patient was going to respond to before we even prescribed that drug, right? And then from either the manufacturers or the investors' perspective, what if we could take all that information and actually then say, well, how are we going to protect the other half of our investment? If our investment only really worked in half the cases, what can we do to really maximize our investment or really protect all that IP and everything else that we're doing? So again, here, I think the advent of digital technologies, big data analytics, they've got a role to play in healthcare, but really also how we discover, develop, and bring new drugs and devices to market. I had the benefit recently of hearing a presentation from the CEO of a rapidly growing pharmaceutical company, and they focus on rare and kind of unmet diseases. And what was really interesting is this CEO talked a little bit about drug discovery and the challenges, et cetera, but he spent a lot of his time focusing on the impact of digital technologies, big data, and analytics on his business and on his company strategy. Why? Because he recognized that he was going to, yes, have to develop drugs that delivered on unmet needs. He recognized that he was going to have to take advantage of big data and analytics to deliver on this promise of outcome and making sure that in real world and real life experience we're actually curing disease. But he also knew he was going to have to pay particular attention to regulators around the world to make sure that as they developed the drug, as they developed the process, as they developed the clinical package, that indeed was going to be a drug that they could get approved. And he said, a key for us is going to be knowing how to develop the right partnerships. And he went on to say, right, and we heard that, right, with Dr. Fitzgerald, we heard that on the panel, this notion of ecosystem and partnerships, really what I've heard this CEO say, what I've heard other leaders say, what's really important to us in our strategy is not only how we discover and develop drugs faster, but do we have the right talent to take advantage of digital technologies, big data and analytics? Do we have the right strategy in place for knowing how to make the two, our traditional business and our new digital age business, come together? And this key question, what partnerships are we going to have to form to really be a big player and make that ecosystem work? Not the kinds of questions that you typically expect to hear from a CEO of a pharmaceutical company, from a presentation for an hour. But he talked about some of the traditional topics, spent more than half his time on what I'd call these new areas of discussion. At PwC, we have a Health Research Institute that publishes a lot of really interesting research around regulatory affairs, around the industry itself, the healthcare marketplace. Some of the topics that they touch on are summarized up top. Topics like new entrants to the healthcare marketplace, the focus on health and not just healthcare. They've also published an article called the Top Health Industry Trends for 2015. I'm going to touch on a few of them here, but they've got a few interesting concepts that I'll mention briefly here. In the context of the new health economy, we talk about both orchestrators and creators, where the orchestrators are what I'd call the technologists. They're all the professionals that are going to develop the digital platforms, the technologies, the application, the software, the infrastructure that we're going to need to build solutions around. And the creators are all the entities that are going to build those next generation solutions, whether they're sensors and wearables, whether they're taking advantage of big data analytics, the Internet of Things, et cetera. But really, the question I think for a lot of companies in the future is going to be, outside of being a traditional healthcare company, where are we either going to place our bets, or where are we going to play in that ecosystem on either the orchestrator or the creator end of the spectrum? A couple of the topics that I said I would touch on. One I think is really interesting to consider when it comes to health, and it's this notion of do-it-yourself healthcare. I know it's a bit of an eye chart for a lot of us here, but what we see on the left is the percentage of physicians who are willing to consider certain do-it-yourself healthcare treatments. On the right are the percentage of patients. And you see things like the percentage of patients who are willing to, I'll make sure I can read, my glasses are getting weak there, but check their vital signs with their device and their phone, send a digital photo of a skin problem to their dermatologist, right? One I think is really incredible, the one from the second from the bottom there, is having their own electrocardiogram taken with some sort of device, like their iPhone or their iPad, and sending the results to the cardiologist. I think that's incredible. I spoke recently to the Healthcare Distributors Management Association, and that was all about the advent of the continued evolution of serialization to try to protect our pharmaceutical and our biotech supply chain. And the point I made to him here, which I'll submit to you, is if we as patients and consumers are so willing to take on more and more of our own health care, how long are we really going to live without being able to verify the authenticity of our drugs, right? Because we saw some of the videos, right, from Dr. Fitzgerald. We all go to the pharmacy, we pick up our drugs. How do we really know what we have, right? I mean, when I order steaks, I can not only know what I order, where it came from, I can track it as it's being delivered, and I can verify that when I get home, it's still, the dry aspect at least was intact. I don't have that kind of level of security, or as a patient, I don't really know that my drug supply chain is that safe. I think we as consumers and patients are going to drive more and more the need for that kind of level of use of big data, analytics, and information as we become more and more comfortable with delivering our own health care. The panel made this point really well. Again, lots of small words on the chart, but back in 2011, where was a lot of the technology investment going? Yes, to some degree, big data analytics, but it was really patient engagement, telemedicine. As time went on from 2011 to 2012, there was continued investment in things like electronic health records. But in 2014, the biggest slice of the pie was on big data analytics. So if you follow the money and you think about what's happening from a collaborative healthcare ecosystem that's trying to deliver health and health cure, big data analytics, I think, is one way where we're going to see continued disruption and really changing our paradigms in how we discover, deliver, and make sure that these drugs and devices are really hitting the outcome. I think the other really interesting discussion for healthcare, and a lot of this discussion really does start, I think, at the manufacturer level and continues all the way through the whole supply chain, from manufacturer through distributor through healthcare provider, is this balance of privacy and convenience. And why do I think this is going to be so important? Let's think about what's happened in other industries. Think about things like online shopping of old. How has that changed? Well, we've given up, right, kind of the concerns around privacy, et cetera. We're willing to put a button on our wash machine, press that button a few days before our detergent's running out, and tell Amazon to go ahead and deliver it. How about banking, right? In days of old, I can remember going to a teller and wanting to be very personal with a teller and have my own banking transactions and deposit my weekly paycheck on Friday afternoons. Well, now, even if I get a paycheck, I'm willing to scan it on my iPhone and send it, somewhere, and it gets deposited into my account. How about ticketing with an agent, right? I can remember having to, before I travel, go to my corporate travel department and pick up the 3-page carbon copy airline ticket. Now, if I can't not only check in, but go through security and get a seat on my iPhone, I get really agitated. And a lighthearted example, I mean, we're all used to sending birthday cards and holiday cards. I recently had a birthday, and my wife gave me a very nice card, and I turned to the kids and I said, "Where's your card?" They all opened up their laptops, pressed a button, and these dancing zoo animals were singing happy birthday to me. And I thought right away, that's a disruption to an industry, right? But what's this really mean for healthcare? You think about healthcare, we're facility-based, it's very time-consuming, again, manual, episodic, and think about the payment structure. If anyone could really tell me how payments really work in healthcare, I can't figure it out. I'd really like to understand. But again, I think an interesting concept here when we talk about big data, analytics, and this balance between privacy and convenience. What's happened in the last 10 years, at least in healthcare, is we focused on how we were going to keep data in. Whether it's in our own manufacturing facility, in our own development lab, in our own healthcare facility, we think the next 10 years, we're going to be focused on how we can get that data out, how we can make the best use of that data outside. So change is already here, because if you, again, pick up on these concepts of healthcare being kind of very manual and kind of clunky for us, if you will, what's going to happen when healthcare becomes more and more remote? We as patients and consumers demand healthcare to be fast, on demand, health or healthcare focused, and we're really paying for outcomes, paying for performance. I think that has some immediate implications for industry, right? I go back to, just from a supply chain perspective, we're going to have to be able to make sure we can secure the supply chain, make sure that we can identify the medication that patients are taking, and prove that it's not only what the medication is supposed to be, but it's not expired, et cetera. That it's the right dose, and that we're taking the right dose at the right time. That we have better ways of ordering and managing our prescriptions as patients and consumers. And we can be a part of proving the value and delivering on this notion of getting the right outcome for all this investment and all this cost and all this money that it's costing us as patients and consumers. So last but not least, when we think about kind of this new health economy, right? Care is going to become more and more decentralized and, again, health-focused and not just healthcare-focused. the speed of innovation is accelerating rapidly. And when you think about our changing demographic, when you think about the advent of technology, when you think about disruptions and new entrants to the healthcare market, innovation is going to be much more than just traditional R&D. Again, this notion of collaborative, multi-stakeholder environments is something that we're going to have to continue to invest in, figure out across healthcare, and really make it work to deliver on the promise of better outcomes. I think a really important consideration, this goes back to the comments we made on what we need for our new strategies, right, and our new capabilities, especially in the manufacturing sector, is that, yes, digital platforms, digital technologies are going to be really important tools. But the industry right now is not one that really understands how to develop and wield those tools to the best degree possible. So investments in strategy, talent, how we're going to do the best we can with this technology, and how we're going to partner with these technologies are going to become critical for us. So hopefully that helps kind of wrap up multiple perspectives that we heard tonight. Hopefully it still helps keep us a little bit on time and room for a couple questions.
So I just came back from AHIP a few weeks ago, and one of the big challenges that they've been talking about is, on one hand, we have this huge consumerism aspect kind of playing in, wanting to move towards more retail, more wearables, and all of that. And on the other hand, you have this huge issue with data and security and all the regulatory aspects that one has to go to. So some insights around that as to, how do you see it shifting? We've been talking about the ACA Act from a long time now, 2000, at least 10 onwards. There's been a lot of discussion. Do you see a transformation happening in that particular space?
So is your question back to that balance between privacy and...
Yeah, balance between consumerism versus privacy. And do you see things really shifting in the direction of consumerism?
Absolutely. And again, multiple cases. I mean, I see it personally, we're demanding it more and more, right? I mean, we heard the frustration in one of the early questions about, having to go different places to get your medical records and get your information and have to transfer it from one doctor to another. I think you even heard Dr. Fitzgerald in one way or another mention his frustration as a healthcare provider, right? And some of the limitations that they have in terms of information. So I see that shift in the health care environment, right, where care is being directed toward patients. But I think in a large degree, you can also see that in the manufacturing end, right? We think about some of the collaborations that are happening now. The traditional drug discovery model, where everything was kind of kept within the four walls, right? And a drug discovery device development is a much more collaborative play between not only manufacturers and healthcare providers, but traditional manufacturers and new entrants, traditional manufacturers and payers or governments. So I think that balance is shifting. There's a much greater emphasis on data sharing and collaboration. It's going to be slow. There's still going to be all sorts of regulatory hurdles, and I think IP and commercial considerations.
I was just again just to that point, would some larger player kind of come and disrupt it? Maybe something like Google.
Like a Google.
Yeah, because the traditional industry has been in a flux for a long time, right? And there's been back and forth. So I'm just curious to know if there's anything like that happening, or could it just be a very gradual process?
So I think of that question and the answer very much like the last question that was posed to the panel, right, is I think you're still going to have the regulators. And so to some degree, even though in the non-regulated commercial environment, the pace of change can be much more rapid, we're still going to have to deal with either government or quality type regulations that are going to put a governor on that to some degree.
In the interest of time, let's keep the questions short and precise if you can. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very informative discussion. One subject we didn't touch on is ethics. And I'm referring primarily to the fact that with all this data out there, I mean, all of this digital health stuff is good stuff, but with all the data out there, I'm sure there is going to be a trend towards predicting dispositions. And then that then translates to denial of service. So how do you address the issue of ethics?
Yeah, that is a great question. I mean, I personally think that's where government is going to play a bit of a role, and thank goodness, right? That's again the comment. To some degree, thank goodness we have regulation. Not that they're always going to have the best answer for us as individuals, but I think they sometimes are in the best position to look over the population and think about where those ethical dilemmas really are. Other than that, you're just going to have to continue balance between what's going to drive new innovation in commerce versus what we as individuals are going to allow in terms of what information is going to be out there and what might it be used for. I don't think we've tested that enough really to know either what's going to change it a lot or where the solution and where the kind of governance is going to be around that. I think we're still very early on in what we're used to in terms of data sharing and data privacy.
Last question.
I was just going to try and reply to your question. I think some of it comes down to the liability on the cost of management. So you got massive demographic issues with chronic care and aged care, and they're not insured, or that they've got disposition towards certain diseases. Are you going to let them, go at it alone and suffer, or is the government going to pick up that cost, or is society going to go pick up that cost? So I think the regulatory environment and the care environment has to change in order to make sure that if you do find out about disposition, we are able to take care of our elders or those with chronic care. So it comes down to a society doing it together.
I think you have one last question, and then we'll end this event.
I think this goes to the question about the privacy versus companies which are not from the healthcare side getting into the business. And I'll give two examples. I used to work, a friend of mine's cardiologist, right? And he gave this example where he had a patient who had a pacemaker, and every Saturday, when they checked, there was a spike. Turned out that was the time he was getting a little comfortable with his girlfriend. So there comes a privacy question. That tomorrow, if your data goes to Apple, what do they do with it? Second, the example you gave of your son self-diagnosing. When we first got these digital thermometers, my kid was little. First time I got it, I was very happy to get this $80 thing, which would give me a result right then and there. And guess what I was doing? Every half an hour, I was sticking it into his ear, and then it goes up slightly or goes up. I call the nurse. Answer back is, you don't need to take temperature every half an hour. So I think all this big data or all this data getting sucked into these companies, there are two issues of privacy as well as interpretation. And the biggest risk is false positives. So what do you see the companies that you deal with as saying related to this?
Well, that, I think in part goes back to the point I made about there's going to be innovation that's required on how to make the ecosystem work. And the question about ethics, data privacy, the usefulness of all the data that we can collect, right? Where do we need to stop with the data? What's good enough? Again, I think we're so early on in first of all, unleashing that data, like spending the next 10 years letting the data go out and making use of it. I think there needs to be innovation for how all of the disruptions, traditional development, healthcare delivery, all that has to work. So I think right now there's more questions than there are answers. And the other thing too goes back to my opening comment and where are my friends from dinner. I bet you your friend also might have been having bacon on Saturday. So that.
That note, thank you all for coming.